One of the more interesting things I've been privy to of late is this attempt to create what is sometimes referred to as a type of new liberalism. And much of this is related to the old skeptics guard, and they call themselves liberalists. In this video, I want to map out some issues concerning both liberalists and society and politics, large, interlacing, interconnected, interlocking issues. One of the things that really shocked me in my interactions with some of these liberalists, and you could almost use the term liberalist as a sort of de facto term describing an acolyte, follower, and or supporter of Sargon of Akkad, is the constant fallback to purely abstract principles. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean very specifically that the credo of liberalism, which is very difficult to define, mind you, but generally speaking, goes something like this. Maximize freedom, and it's a kind of libertarian-esque vision of society, although not entirely, depending on whom you ask. That all these people do is focus on abstract principles. And originally I thought they did so even with the knowledge of things that are not abstract principles that could have a detrimental effect on their guiding presets. So, for example, not too long ago I was discussing at length the negative impact of single parenthood, specifically single motherhood, and I'll post some links in the low bar in case you're interested in exploring this more. And I explained that there are many studies now that have established correlations between single motherhood and negative childhood outcomes, that it's not a good thing in general. And the level of ignorance on the part of the liberalists was so astounding that they had never even heard of these things. They'd never heard of divorce rates being exceedingly high, or for that matter, women being the large majority of initiators, etc. And effectively, what some of their tactics came down to were telling me that I basically was slut-shaming in a certain way. They didn't use that terminology. So, well, about single fathers. Well, there aren't as many data points on single fathers, but what we do know, and link in the low bar, is that single fathers do earn more, provide greater income to their children than single mothers do. And this is obviously something that needs to be further explored. But we know single parenthood is bad, and we know that single motherhood is bad, and this is just almost universally corroborated. They didn't know anything about this. And the extent that they didn't think it was terribly important because of their adherence to these abstract principles. Everything comes down to abstract principles. Biological reality be damned. Now, if all you do is focus on abstract principles, and you never take the time to address underlying principles of biology that lead to circumstances such as single motherhood, the state of affairs in society, whether it comes to sex differences or quote-unquote racial differences, genetic population differences, differences in outcome, and all you do is LARP on about liberalism or libertarianism or whatever abstract principle you find might suit your fancy at any given moment, you're going to have problems. Because abstract principles are all well and good, but the conception of virtually every abstract principle has historically been one born of a conception that did not directly tie into biology, not principles born of people thinking about human nature, biology, and its interaction with the world at large, and working on that modus operandi, but just ideals. And this is the big flaw with both Sargon and liberalists, and really anyone who completely ignores biological reality. Ideals are all well and good, but ideals will always clash with things that sit in opposition to those ideals, that are not in fact, in concert with those ideals because they're part of our biology and we choose to ignore them. Now, there have been some arguments, people to the effect of saying, well, I'm perfectly fine, I don't know, not letting women just receive endless benefits from the state or special privileges in education or whatever. Paid maternity leave is a big one. Some people say that, but I have my doubts. And part of the reasons for this video is that I don't think people really can stand by and do nothing. There's a real difficulty in doing nothing. That is, just letting the chips fall as they may or where they may. I don't think people can do that. Historically, they can't do this. And this kind of reminds me of some older videos by Barbarossa back in the day, where you can offer all the traditional conservative libertarian talking points on, cutting off the welfare state, but when, and I'm paraphrasing, when starving mothers and children on the street, that's not happening. And so all you're basically left with are these abstract principles and not much of a leg to stand on, because you're not even willing to, frankly speaking, sit by and watch people suffer because they might not be able to make it in a certain context. Where is this going to get us ultimately? I should add, furthermore, that some of these people astounded me with their lack of interest in actual data, points of information. They used anecdotal experiences. They didn't have any interest in the bigger, broader picture. And I think this is deadly. Now, on the other hand, I think that a lot of this is just sort of internet society, if you will, and internet cliques and what have you. But in a sense, what we can see these days, many of the, if not most of the problems of society, is a society that operates out of a purely ideologically driven set of principles and ideals. Just the way you want the world to be. If the proper counter to that is just another version of the way you want the world to be, one, and two, you cannot simply sit by and let things happen. For example, uneven outcomes, Pareto distribution, whatever, well, then you have a real problem. Because in some sense, all you end up with are talking points that in actuality and in fact, if they are mapped onto the real world, if they were rendered actionable, would not be that different from the current state of affairs. I mean, for example, again, cutting down the welfare state, its effects on minority populations, its effects on single mothers, children without fathers. Would people really, and let's be honest, really be able to stand by and just watch these poor folks suffer? I don't think so. And so everything would just perpetuate itself. The truth is that we are remiss in not integrating biological reality into abstract principles. I don't even think abstract principles should be the guiding light of how we move forward. And if you're not willing to be somewhat cruel, or at the very least indifferent, we're not heading anywhere. If we're guided purely by compassion and pure emotion, we're not heading anywhere. It will just be status quo again and again and again until the system collapses or cannot support itself anymore or whatever. And I don't know when or if ever that will happen. But operating only on abstract principles is a bad idea. And I think, and I've said this before, that we're in a state now where we've abdicated our ability to be judicious and to say, well, yeah, there will be negative consequences for this type of behavior. Quite the opposite. And for the liberalists who might hear this, I mean, the arguments I hear are basically, let women do what they want. Letting people do whatever they want has, to a certain extent, got us where we are now. And yes, that behavior is incentivized. But, in addition to that, if you say, okay, let women do what they want, but it won't be incentivized, are you willing to watch the poor women folks suffer? Or any other group, some sort of minority group that you have a particular affinity for? That's the real question going forward. And I don't see these questions being answered. I see no entry into the political sphere with regards to these things. And so there are many, many open questions here. But I think it's very important to push these discussions into the public sphere so people can actually talk about these things. But we need to have the right principles. And it's not even clear what the right principles are yet. But operating off of a kind of almost God-inspired set of abstract principles about liberalism and democratic liberalism or liberal democracy or however you want to term it, this tells us nothing and it does nothing. Because there needs to be a bit more to it, more meat on the bones. And this is the great deficiency I see with the liberalists and, well, society at large. Pure abstraction never worked particularly well, and it never will. So it's time to dirty our hands by learning the details of human biology, and it's time to be judicious in who we accord our compassion to and why we do it. If we don't want to incentivize certain behaviors, we have to allow the people who are participating in those behaviors to suffer consequences so they can learn from them, some other people can learn from them, and not just perpetually prop them up. Anyway, that's enough on this matter. More to come if I'm still alive. You take care and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.